an evidence-based, legitimate scientific and medical industry, and then the second is a fear-based, hype-filled remediation industry, and the two are diametrically opposed. Most of what you encounter is going to be the fear-based industry, and as a scientist, I'm here to give you the evidence-based, scientifically valid, and medically valid based mold industry's perspective. And so the handout that Chris is going to get is going to show that very clearly. There are just 2 pages in the handout. One is from Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, and they put together a mold page, if you will, just a little handout. And then attached to it is a mold inspector's advertisement, which you will see, and I didn't pick these out in any particular, I didn't bias this in any way. Johns Hopkins is a very reputable scientific and medically valid school. They understand health effects very, very well. And I selected out of the blue a certified mold inspector's advertisement. And you will be able to see for yourself, one is evidence-based, and it's legitimate. The other one is so full of hyperbole and fear that that you can see where these 2 different industries are coming from. I've been involved in mold issues since about 1989. I've testified widely across the U.S. on mold-related issues. I've testified in Supreme Courts in Pennsylvania, courts in Colorado, including civil courts as well as criminal courts. I testified on behalf of the Department of Justice on mold-related issues in marijuana grows, for example. I have never lost a case, ever. And essentially what we do is we just stick to the facts. We stick to the evidence-based presentation. You're going to see throughout this, I spell mold a funny way. I'm a member of the ASTM International Standards Committee, the D2208 committee. My role on that International Standards Committee is to write standards on how to assess for molds. Our standards are international standards. They are used in every country. They are true standards, meaning that that in order to get a standard passed, it must be vetted by the entire ASTM organization. Typically, to pass one of these standards, it takes about 7 years to get a standard to pass. They are a very arduous process. And as part of the international community, this is how I spell molds. This is what I'm going to stick to. And so there you have it. For those of you who've been through one of my talks before, you know that I go very, very quickly. And I present an awful lot of information that I don't necessarily expect people to absorb it all, but rather it gives you an idea of what's out there. And then Michelle is going to have a copy of the presentation available to you so that you can go back again and follow up on various references and things that I've said. So it's to raise an awareness and to give you a source that you can go back to again and to try to follow up on some of these things. So objectives are going to be to understand the nature of fungi, and all of this is as it relates to your industry. I've geared this talk for the real estate industry. Understand the significance of occurrence of fungi, understand assessment protocols, state of knowledge, health effects, kind of, we're going to be touching on that, and Chris has given out that handout, but also as a bit of a perk, at the end of this, you're going to become a certified mold inspector, okay? And here's why. Because the next time some knucklehead scuttles one of your deals by coming up saying, oh, I found toxic mold, here's my lab test, you can go, that test is invalid. And he'll go, I'm a certified mold inspector. You can go, so am I. Yeah, and your certificate that you're going to be getting is going to be every bit as valid, every bit as lawful, and every bit as meaningful as theirs, okay? The only difference is you actually are going to have received some valid information on molds. You actually are going to have some scientific basis for being able to speak on the issue of molds. 99% of the mold inspectors out there, that certificate, they went to a 3-day class that taught them how to collect a sample. That's it. Or some of them, there are about 40 different organizations handing out certificates. As of today, there's 41 because I'm going to become one of them, all right? And you're all going to get a certificate. Throughout the United States, none of the certificates are valid. Not one of them is recognized. So when somebody comes up and they say, I'm a certified mold inspector, all they've told you is they could be a 12-year-old kid who sat at their computer and they printed out a certificate that said they're a certified mold inspector. All right? In Colorado, just as in most other states, the certifications are completely meaningless. They are empty. You can just sit down and print out your own certificate, but your certificate that you're going to be getting is going to have my name on it, and it's actually going to be valid because you actually went through a class. You actually would have learned something about it. And this is going to give you a little bit of ammunition to fight these guys that are out there messing up real estate deals with their meaningless samples and their talk about toxic mold. So, if you were to fall asleep in the next 2 minutes, essentially, if you can come away with what this slide says, you will have everything that you really need to know. You just won't be able to back it up very well. So, the takeaways for today is, number one, there is no such thing as toxic mold. It has never existed. There has never been toxic mold. Toxic mold, the term, was a creation by sensationalist news outlets back in 1995. There is no such thing as toxic mold. There is no such thing as toxic black mold. There is no such thing as a concern about black mold. This is all hype. None of this is evidence-based. There is no toxicologically important or significance to the color of a mold. A white mold can be green at some times, it can be red sometimes, it might be black at some times. There is absolutely no significance to the color of a mold other than it helps us to identify what the mold might be or how old the mold might be. Because if you have a white mold or a green mold and then it dies, it can turn black. Okay? So, no such thing as toxic black mold. 2, none of the testing that's being performed by mold people is valid. None of it is valid. It is entirely unimportant what is on that laboratory report. The labs are legitimate laboratories. The lab reports are legitimate lab reports. The samples are invalid, and we're going to talk about why. And they are entirely meaningless. And we're going to see who recommends sampling, and more importantly, we're going to find out who says do not do sampling. None of the certificates used by mold inspectors are recognized. There are only 2 states in the union that recognize the certificates, and it's a very contentious issue. We're not one of them. Doesn't matter who the rest of them are, but essentially, anybody can be a certified mold inspector by sitting at their computer, printing out a certificate, and therefore they are a certified mold inspector. That's it. That's the only thing that it means. Sampling is virtually never performed during a legitimate mold inspection, and we're going to see why. The only people who are doing mold testing and mold sampling are those who are charlatans and those who are very, very misled, that may have a good heart, but they're very misled. Legitimate mold inspectors will almost never take a sample, and in fact, when it goes to court, the samples are what guarantee me a win. I mentioned I never lost a case, and it is precisely because the samples and the tests that these guys use are the rope by which I hang them. Because if they'd never collected a sample, I have a difficult time beating them in court. Once they collect a sample, I own them. And I will get them disqualified and their case will fall apart. Every person in this room already possesses sufficient intelligence, training, experience, and knowledge to do a mold inspection. You just don't know that you do. You don't have the confidence. You've been told maybe that you don't, that you have to have special training. The reality is this. If you have the mental wherewithal to identify a moldy lemon in your refrigerator, and you have sufficient knowledge on how to handle that moldy lemon, you have enough information and experience to be a mold inspector in a house. Okay? If you cannot identify a moldy lemon, and you would have to call a hazardous waste company or a mold inspector to come and tell you how to take care of a moldy lemon, then I don't know what to say. So, why are we here then? If there's no such thing as toxic mold, and all the sampling that's being done is invalid, and none of the certificates are valid, then how did this whole thing come about, and why are we here? We're here because of misinformation starting in 1995, marketing, fear, uncertainty, and science fiction. Okay. Toxic molds became the buzzword in 1995. And since then, it has taken a life of its own. And if you will remember Peter Sandman's equation, we talked about this in one of the previous discussions. In risk communication, risk, the perception of risk, is hazard plus outrage. And in our previous discussion, we talked about what was a hazard. And we mentioned that a hazard is something that has intrinsic health effects or an intrinsic ability to produce harm. And then we talked about all of the different factors that go into that. And so eventually what happens is that hazard becomes identified with a risk. And one of the multipliers for that risk is outrage. And part of that outrage is going to be, how exotic is it? Well, ionizing radiation was a good example when we talked about radon, because we said there's all these science fiction movies out there about how radiation causes mutants and all that, and people don't really understand radiation. And so the fear factor goes up. So as the hazard becomes more exotic and you have less control over it, it makes it easier to frighten people. Okay, so we're going to put all this back into perspective again. So how do we fix it? How do we fix the current problem? We fix the current problem with good information, evidence-based information. Something where you can, after this course, you can go and you can say, no, the EPA doesn't say that. Let me tell you what the EPA really says in their mold guideline and why they say do not do sampling. You'll be able to go back and you'll be able to say, no, Mr. Inspector, that is not what the Centers for Disease Control. Let me tell you what the Centers for Disease Control really says. In fact, here's a quote from the Centers for Disease Control. Let me tell you what the state of Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment really says about mold sampling. The World Health Organization, here's what they really say. You'll be able to actually now go back to those quotes, and when you've got some knucklehead mold inspector telling you that this house has toxic mold and it just scuttled your deal, you'll be able to explain why there's no such thing as toxic mold. And the Centers for Disease Control, by the way, that study that you referenced with the 13 children in Ohio that are dying, yeah, the CDC retracted that almost 20 years ago. You're behind times. You need to come up to date on what the literature really shows. So good science, educational programs, just like this. Thank you, Michelle, for putting it together. Marketing through professional memberships, okay, through your real estate memberships. Perspective. We went into toxicology a little bit in the last discussion. So you learned what the difference was between association, correlation, and causation. And we're going to talk about those. We're going to touch on those in the health aspects of molds. And then confidence, knowledge. To be able to stand up against some guy that says, I'm a certified mold inspector, you have to have the confidence, because he's bamboozling. That's all based on being bold and presenting yourself as being knowledgeable in something, because they know that you don't know that they're a fraud. So by having the confidence to stand in front of that person and go, yeah, I know, I'm a certified mold inspector too. So let me set you straight. So confidence, that comes with knowledge. Now, what are molds? What is fungi? We used to, in the olden days, we used to have various kingdoms, biological kingdoms. If you go back to your high school biology, we spoke about various kingdoms. We no longer, that's very archaic now, we no longer use kingdoms. But if you go back to your high school biology, or even maybe your college biology, you probably remember that fungi was the fifth kingdom. They refer to it as the fifth kingdom. And a mold is simply a filamentous fungi. That's all. So molds are not even a scientific classification. They're a morphological observation. So if I had a bunch of yeasts, which are unicellular fungi, and I had a mat of those yeasts, they are fungi, and if they agglomerated, say for example, in production of beer or wine or cheese or something, and then as that mat got together and we had more and more cells, if they started to produce filaments, which they often will do for a variety of reasons, it would go from being a yeast to a mold. That's all. And then once those filaments are shed and maybe those unicellular organisms separate again, then it's no longer a mold anymore. But the organism hasn't changed. Only its visual characteristic has changed. So molds are just simply any fungi with hair, kind of hairy protrusions, all right? And so molds are not a classification, they're merely an observation that some fungi are going to produce. They are ubiquitous on Earth. Right now, half of you, statistically, half of you have mold colonies growing in your nasal cavities right now. All of us have mold in our respiratory tract right now, and statistically, half of us actually have actively growing molds in our nasal cavities. Every breath you take, you inhale mold spores. This carpet, right now, if we were to sample the carpet, probably has somewhere between 50,000 and 150,000 colony-forming units per gram of removable material. In this room alone are billions and billions of mold spores. If you step outside, you will be exposed to mold. If you go into a lake, the ocean, if you go anywhere, there is no place that you could physically put a person that mold does not exist. It is ubiquitous. It is extremely ancient. It predates us. We moved into the world of molds. Molds have not invaded our environment. We have invaded the mold environment and the fungi environment. Genetically diverse. There are over 1 million examples, known as exemplars, that are awaiting to be named. You'll see a couple of photographs of some organisms that I've submitted to botanical gardens and some universities that nobody's ever named. They look at it and they go, yeah, we'll put that in with the collection, and someday, maybe somebody will name that organism. Because there's just so many, it's very, very difficult to come up with names for them all. And until we got into what's called phylogeny, which is the genetic naming of organisms, we really had no good way of differentiating the different organisms. So very diverse. They are very diverse in size. One of the largest living organisms on the planet Earth is a mold that lives in Michigan. Covers 37 acres, estimated to weigh in at 22,000 pounds. Okay? And it's a single organism. It's also probably one of the oldest organisms. It is genetically stable. They're not sure exactly how old it is, but been able to verify that it's at least 1,500 years old, and it is genetically stable. It is a single organism. It is a single thing, a single living thing. And it is extremely old. It is extremely large. So everywhere that you go, you will encounter molds. From a medical perspective, molds are very important. They are what's called the etiological agent. They are the etiology of mycoses. And mycoses cover a very broad spectrum of pathologies. The ones that we are most familiar with are things like jock itch, athlete's foot, cradle cap, ringworm in children. Those are really very, very common. Any of us who've had kids, we end up with cradle cap or ringworm in your kids. Those are fungi. Those are fungal infections. Aspergillosis. Aspergillosis is a very significant secondary pathology for those who are what are called moribund, people who are already on death's door, if you will. Their immune system shuts down either through old age, perhaps primary pathologies such as cancer or AIDS or something else that has knocked out their immune system. And so they become very susceptible to a particular organism, a genus known as Aspergillus. It invades the lungs. And it is extremely rare in otherwise healthy people. Extremely rare, but it does happen. Probably the single most important mycosis in the United States is San Joaquin Valley fever. And it is pandemic in the United States, primarily in northwestern Texas, Southern California. Throughout that area, there's a very large geographical area known as San Joaquin Valley, and then all the surrounding proximity. There is an organism that lives in the soil there, and it does invade people. You don't hear much about it because you can't sue anybody. What you can do is sue God. God put it in the soil, and you moved to that area, and now you came down with it. And so it's just out there. It's like measles. People get it, and it doesn't make the news because it's there. It just is there. And so it's pandemic in some parts of the United States. So mycoses are very, very important. And molds are terribly important also to our economy because we eat them. And we use molds and fungi for a variety of reasons. That plant over there that's on that shelf cannot come to full fruition and thrive if it wasn't for molds. The mycorrhiza around the roots are symbiotic with the plant. The mycorrhiza are what help the roots bring in nutrients. The fungus that's associated with the roots in that plant and virtually every other plant, they benefit from the plant for stability and protection, and in turn they break down nutrients and they give it to the root so that the plants can use them. Wine, beer, those are cheeses. These are all brought, if you buy grapes and you look at the white powder on a grape, that's all fungus. That's naturally occurring fungus that's on those grapes. Go down to King Soopers and get some salami. That white stuff that's covering the outside of the salami that you're going to eat, that's all mold. That's mold. Go get Stilton or Roquefort or Blue or any of those other kinds of cheeses. That marbling that's in there, that marbling is mold. All right? And by the way, these two types of mold that are present both on salami and in, for example, Stilton cheese, they produce extremely toxic compounds called mycotoxins. But because you guys have an inkling of toxicology, remember, the dose makes the poison. You have inherent toxicology, you have something that's inherently hazardous, but the wisdom of Paracelsus told us that there's nothing that's so dangerous that if you don't have a small enough dose, it's harmless. And so even though the mycotoxins produced by Roqueforti and some of the Penicillium species on salami, although they produce some of the single most toxic substances known to man, we eat them. We eat them because they taste good. And the doses that we receive are generally non-toxic. I say generally because you want an experience, okay, but you can't afford LSD? Well, here's what you do. Go get some Stilton cheese tonight, or make it a Friday night, right? Little bit of red wine, all right? And put, what's that campy movie? The Rocky Horror Picture Show. Go eat some Stilton cheese, get some good red wine, and you will hallucinate that night, guaranteed. Because the mycotoxins that are in there, they are powerful hallucinogens. You eat enough of Stilton, and most of you, not all, some of you just go, I can't even stand the taste of the Stilton. But you'll hallucinate. It's quite a trip. It's legal, right? So I'm not going to come and get you, okay? So anyway, we have bread. All of our leavened bread. When we talk about leavening, that's what leavening is. Leaven is the yeast that produces the CO2 and produces the bubbles that give you bread, that raises bread. Our foods are full of fungi, just absolutely chock-a-block full of fungi. So we not only swim in it, we not only inhale it, we eat it, and we require it for a lot of our commercial products. We require fungi. So the idea that we should be afraid of fungi is just simply unwarranted. So we find it everywhere. There's really very few places on this earth are devoid of molds. That would include the deep sea vents, for example, or some of these hot geysers in Yellowstone, places like that. Even molds can't thrive in those. But otherwise, it's everywhere. We also know that every house, every structure, every courtroom, attorney's office, library, school, this office, every structure that you can place a person has the kind of mold in it that the sensationalists refer to as toxic black mold. There is no structure into which you can put a human that does not have toxic black mold in it. And I got involved with a relocation company that said, well, we have a zero tolerance policy. We will not put a person in a house that has Stachybotrys. It's like, well, then you're going to go out of business, because you will not be able to find a structure anywhere in North America that does not have Stachybotrys in it, and by the billions. Stachybotrys. Doug Rice, Dr. Doug Rice, who's the professor of microbiology up at CSU, when he needs a new culture of Stachybotrys, all he does is he goes out into the hallway when nobody's looking, takes out his penknife, and he cuts into the drywall. And he takes a little square out of the drywall, takes it back to his lab, and he adds water. That's where he gets his scientific cultures, right? It's from the hallway. It's because drywall is chock-a-block full of billions and billions of mold spores, including Stachybotrys atra, the famous toxic black mold. So it's everywhere. Every breath that you take contains hundreds to hundreds of thousands of mold spores. So when somebody goes into a house and they say they collected a sample and guess what, they found mold, that's like saying, I went into a house and I found air. Well, yeah, you found air. There's air in every house. And if you sample for it, you'll find it. Same thing with molds. Go into any structure. If you sample for it, you will find it. And depending on what you want to show, we'll show you how to play the numbers game. Depending on what you want to show, you can either show there's a lot of mold there, or you can show that there's no mold there, or not much, depending on how dishonest you are and how well you actually understand your own samples. You can show anything you want. So let's look at what the accepted body of science is saying with regard to health hazards. This comes from the American Industrial Hygiene Association. This next quote, it says, the literature review indicates that currently there is inadequate evidence supporting a causal relationship. Remember, we had association, correlation, and cause. Couldn't have cause without correlation, can't have correlation without at least association. And if you remember, we showed a good association and good correlation between Canadian lynx and sunspots and storks and babies. Statistically, we could show those, but we said, but there's no causal relationship. Okay, so in this case, there was inadequate evidence supporting a causal relationship between symptoms or illness among building occupants and exposure to mycotoxins. When we look at one of the things that John Hopkins says, it's the underlined portion on the third paragraph, and it says, it is highly unlikely that you could inhale enough mold in your home or office to receive a toxic dose. We once, for a court case, calculated how long it would take for you to accumulate a toxic dose of Stachybotrys at the levels of mycotoxin that are present, assuming that you didn't eliminate it, because we do eliminate it very quickly. A human would have to live 22,000 years to get enough of the dose to be toxic. 22,000 years. So when we talk about these chemicals that are toxic, we have to remember that the doses are so low that they're way below that toxicological level we'd identified in our last talk called the NOEL, the No Observable Adverse Effect Level. And it's for that reason that in this room right now, there's carbon monoxide in this room, there's asbestos, there's lead, there's benzene, there's plutonium in the air, and yet we're not all dying. We're not dying because the doses are so low, they are below the NOEL. The lowest level necessary to induce an adverse health effect. And so it is with molds. Next comes from the Annals of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology. Harriet Burge said the primary result of fungal exposures is allergic disease. It's hay fever, pretty much. And that evidence for inhalation diseases resulting from mycotoxin exposure in residential and office settings is extremely weak. That's pretty old. That was 2001. World Health Organization and the National Institutes of Occupational Safety and Health, they've come out with a stronger statement now. They're going, no evidence. Just no evidence. We'll talk about that. So, body of science, here we have American College of Occupational Environmental Medicine, Council on Scientific Affairs, in a document known as the Evidence-Based Statement Adverse Human Health Effects Associated with Molds in the Indoor Environment, 2003. They said, current scientific evidence does not support the proposition that human health has been adversely affected by inhaled mycotoxins in the home, school, or office environment. As I stand here in front of you today, there is not one single case anywhere on the planet Earth of stachybotryotoxicosis occurring from anybody being exposed to toxic black mold in an indoor environment. Not one. Not a single documented case, ever. Black mold, the toxicity associated with it, was very well established in 1945 to about 1947 in Russia, when the Russians were starving to death, and